Hello, AP Human Geography students. Here is your video lecture for Chapter 2, Section 2, Key Issue 2, which is Why is Population Increasing? This one is huge. So, we're going to talk some statistics today. How do we know where population is increasing? We use three measures to calculate population growth. The first one is crude birth rate, and the second one is crude death rate, and the third one is the difference between the two, which is natural increase rate. So crude birth rate is the number of babies born per thousand in a year. Crude death rate is the number of people who die per thousand in a year. And the increase rate is the difference between the two. So if you look at the world crude birth rate is 20, right? You'll see that right here. And the crude death rate is 8. 20 minus 8 is 12. 12 per thousand is 1.2%. Doesn't seem like much, but 1.2% is 80 million new mouths to feed a year. Right? That's nearly a billion added in the last 12 years. The term doubling time, the time it takes for a population to double, is now down to 58 years. And then just keep in mind on a world level that 95% of growth is going to be clustered in LDCs or developing countries. All right? Here you see the rapid change, right, that happened in the last 200, 300 years. This steep curve, right, that started with not very much. And we will get into how does this change over time. We will see again our world population, right, increase happening here, right, at a steady rate. And we are on pace for 8 billion people. Right, natural increase rate. Again, is this a development map? It absolutely is, right? When you look at population happening here and here and here and here, but not in sub-Saharan Africa, that's a good indication that this is a measurement of development. All right, so what do we use to study? There's your crude birth rate, right? And CBR, number of live births per 1,000 in a year. And then a second statistic that is used to measure birth is something called total fertility rate, or TFR. And that's the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years. That's 15 to 49. Again, we know that that's a range that can not necessarily play out. People can have children in their 50s. It's very difficult. People can have children before they're 15. That happens as well. All right. The world average is 2.4, but that changes drastically between development regions, right? So if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's well above 3, whereas we look at some other places are actually below 2, and we'll talk about how that matters as well. Right, so total fertility rate, remember this is an average number, right? 2.4, you can have 0.4 of a kid, it's an average number. Some of you may think your siblings are 0.4 of a human, but that's actually not true. So there's crude birth rate. Does this measure development? Absolutely. Again, you look at sub-Saharan Africa compared to the rest of the world, right, where birth rates, CBRs are sometimes even above 40. Right, so that gets us to talking about what a high number is when it comes to these type of statistics, birth rate, death rate, in particular. Right, we're looking at 20 and above being relatively high. We're looking at below 10 being relatively low, and then 10 to 19 being that gray area. And again, some of that's going to depend on birth rate, death rate as well. Right, so there's TFR. Again, does that matter? Total fertility rate in terms of development absolutely does, right? And again, comparing sub-Saharan Africa to the rest of the world. All right, other ways that we use to study fertility is infant mortality rate, or IMR. And this is a sad statistic. This is the number of infants who die before the age of 1 in a year. This is per 100 per thousand, something along those lines, right? This does not necessarily reflect neglect on a parent's part. It reflects the healthcare system that is in place. Because children who die before the age of 1, it's usually due to lack of medical care. It's not due to lack of calories or food. It's not due to lack of neglect. It's mostly due to the ability to be treated, right, if you are an infant for something like a fever or something along those lines, right? And our second way we study fertility is crude death rate, right? That's called crude death rate, CDR. It's the number of deaths per thousand. We've already covered that, but again, you're going to want to know these terms in and out. Crude death rate is interesting in that it does not, right, measure development, right? Because it's crude, and crude is just a number. Crude means raw, right? And so CDR does not measure development in that it does not talk about how people die, right? And you will find that throughout developed regions, people die of different ways compared to developing regions or LDCs. So the way people die tends to be very different, right, in developed countries versus developing countries. More on that later. Right, so there's infant mortality rate. Again, note that this is a very, very strong ties to development here. There's crude death rate, right, and less so when it comes to this, right? If you look at the North Africa, for example, not as developed as the United States, has a lower death rate, right? Mexico has a lower death rate. Keep in mind that life expectancy matters here too. If you have a population that is very old, people are going to die at a higher rate because old people die at a higher rate, right? So if people are alive and live to a long age, you're going to see crude death rates, right, exist in higher levels. And we go back to the United States, we will see death rates shifting as well in terms of if there's an older population or a younger population. All right, here's a green slide, child mortality rate. It's kids who don't live to see kindergarten essentially, but aren't infants, right? So it's the number of children that die between the ages of 1 and 5 in a country. You're going to see high rates in Africa and Asia. So this isn't necessarily medical related. This is associated with malnutrition or lack of caloric intake, and particularly lack of protein. Right, malnutrition. So up to 20%. So again, another sad statistic here. And sometimes you're going to find that human geography isn't always the most pleasant thing to talk about, that it's not all rainbows and unicorns. Right? Here's a cartogram, and again, you see the vast differences in Asia and Africa compared to the Western Hemisphere, and Europe is almost non-existent right there. We look at under 5 mortality rate here. Again, you can kind of see that play out a bit more. Here's under 5 mortality. Here's another look at it as well. All right, so when we're comparing demographic factors in developed and developing countries, we have the natural increase rate, right? Notice the difference, right? NIR is 1% higher, right? Which is a lot, right? Death rate is doubled. Total fertility rate is almost one more child. Infant mortality rate is a vast difference. Almost 40 more children die before the age of 1. Life expectancy is a flip there, and you can see a 10-year difference there. Death rate, again, in developing countries is higher. Again, death rate does not measure development, right? Because you have an older population. Right, ages of under 15. Right, look at the relatively young developing countries compared to the relatively old developing countries, and we see that flip as well. Right, so lots of different demographic statistics to play out here. All right, on to one of our most important concepts, the demographic transition or the demographic transition model, or the DTM. This one is huge. right? You are going to see this play out throughout a population. It's a societal change in population over a time, and you are also going to see this play out throughout the course um, of your time in AP Human Geography. You need to understand this. It is very important, right? So we can look at cultural and economic factors that play into this, but really what we're looking at here is we're looking at birth rate, right, and death rate, and increase rate, right, and how that changes over the course of time. We have 4 stages here, but we'll talk about a 5th stage as well later on. All right, so stage 1, right? There's a population pyramid for stage 1, right? This is life's early population. We see hunters and gatherers societies, which means they hunt and gather. They don't necessarily stay in one place. They're either chasing herds of animals or going to where the fruits or berries or things that you can gather to eat are readily available. This changes when we have something called the agricultural revolution, or the first agricultural revolution, or the Neolithic agricultural revolution. This leads to permanent settlements, right, where people decide, they figure out that they're better off farming than they are hunting and gathering. And there's an argument that says that's not necessarily the case, but we won't get into it right now. High birth rates and high death rates, right? So you see it's fairly chaotic, right? And so when you have a high birth rate and you couple that with a high death rate, you don't necessarily see a lot of population growth. If you have 40 births but also have 40 deaths, you're not really growing as a population. This is what human history was like up until about 1750, right? So most of the world was like that. Now, there are no countries who are in stage 1 now. All right, so this used to be our history and what the world was like, but it is not like this now anywhere, right? Except for a few maybe scattered places where you still have hunting and gathering societies. All right, so there's stage 1. Note that the birth rate and death rate, this is fairly chaotic. There's famine, there's war, there's pestilence and plague going on. There's all sorts of bad things happening here. And so you'll see that the birth rate will go up as the death rate goes down because people do not want to have children in times of chaos when death rates are very high. So you'll see birth rates and death rates generally are kind of all over the place, but you see birth rates sometimes being up and down. You see death rates sometimes being up and down, and then you see very little growth, right? And if you're below 0, that means your population is shrinking right here. And then you see some growth, and then you see some shrinking. And really that means that population itself doesn't grow at a very high rate over time. All of this changes in stage 2. This is where things get really, really interesting, and we see rapid change in a society, right? This is a time of high growth, right? And this has to do with the death rates dropping, right? Life gets easier for people in Europe and in the United States around 1750 to 1800, somewhere in there. The world's population begins to increase exponentially because people stop dying of things that they used to die of. All right, there is a cultural lag. Birth rates are going to stay high. All right, birth rates are high, death rates are going to plummet, and so you're going to get population growth. There's going to be a lot of cribs, not as many coffins as there were, and so you're going to see this. And this comes about because of the Industrial Revolution. Right, that life gets easier. There's less farming accidents. You see gains in healthcare, antibiotics, and medical procedures get safer. You start to see the introduction of vitamin pills. We're at the very beginning of family planning and contraception at this point. We see a lot of productivity. We see an increase in wealth and an increase in technology, particularly medical technology. This is the US and the European countries up until 1750. The rest of the world stays in stage 2 until 1950. Or they stay in stage 1, I'm sorry, until about 1950. And this is where immunizations and eradication of polio and smallpox and things like that. You see vaccinations happening on a global scale. And we have something called the medical revolution, which drops the rest of the world out of stage 1 and puts them into stage 2. Right? And a lot of lives get saved, right? Think about that. When you have things like antibiotics in a society, or antiseptics that make procedures much cleaner and less likely to have infection. All right, so there's stage 2. Notice the crude birth rate stays the same. There's a cultural lag. People haven't figured out that they don't have to have as many kids as they once did. The death rate plummets due to technology and increase in wealth due to the Industrial Revolution, increase in medical things in 1950 and due to the medical revolution, and you see the natural increase rate go way up. This is a very steep curve right in here. It is exponential growth. All right, stage 2, a good example of stage 2 would be the Gambia, right? And we look at a real life place over time instead of a theoretical place over time, and you see natural increase rate happening, right? In stage 1 up until about 1960, right? And then you see the steep natural increase rate, and you see the death rate go down. Birth rate, again, remains high. All right, there's the world's population. Again, we see this very steep curve, right? This is stage 2 right in here. All right. One other thing we need to talk about that the book does not talk about is the second agricultural revolution and how that helped, right? Second agricultural revolution is another leap forward in terms of technology. So you see things like Europeans starting to do seed selection, where they don't just throw any seed out into the field. Crop rotation, which keeps soil good, right, and vibrant, right? You see changes in storage techniques. You see livestock breeding, selective breeding happening. You see something like the seed drill, which is this picture on the right, which shoots seeds down into the earth and gets them a more robust chance at living. Right? We also see something called the enclosure movement, where land is consolidated and it makes it more efficient. The results of this is that there are less farmers needed, and so when there are less farmers needed, people are going to move for jobs, and they're going to move where? Well, they're going to move to a city. Right? A larger population can be supported, and this, when you move from rural England into London, right, you're going to get a job in a factory, which then boosts productivity as well. So that's the second agricultural revolution. It is tied very much to helping England achieve stage 2, and as well as other European countries. All right, stage 3 is where the cultural lag stops. We start to see a birth rate drop. It's marked by a drop in the crude birth rate. All right, CDR is going to continue to plug away. You're going to see an introduction into things like family planning, contraception, birth control, that type of thing. And because the birth rate and the death rate are dropping, you're going to see increased rates gradually start to decline. It is moderate. Remember, this is kind of a transition between stage 2 and stage 4, but it has to start with a birth rate dropping, right? Death rate's going to continue to drop. We see this happening in the early 1900s. We see a shift in cultural practices. We see a shift in medical practices too, where we start to look at birth control. We see this happening in Asia and Latin America in the last 30 years. This has not necessarily happened yet in African nations, right? Many African nations are still in stage 2. All right, again, we see right here the birth rate dropping right in here, which means then as the death rate continues to drop, you're going to see the natural increase start to drop too. And this gets fairly steep as well, right? It's not as steep as stage 4, but it is we start to see a drop off here. All right, Mexico is a good example of a stage 3 country. Note that the population is still growing, right, during stage 3. It stabilizes in stage 4, but it is still growing, right? We see stage 1 right here. You see the death rate drop in stage 2, but the birth rate stay high. You see the birth rate start to drop there, and therefore the natural increase rate starts to drop too, and again you got a decrease in death rate as well. All right, stage 4 is us. This is the United States. This is the industrialized world. This is the developed nations for the most part, right? Stage 4, you're going to see low growth. Birth rate and death rate are going to equalize. People are living longer, but people are having less kids, right? Which means the natural increase rate is near zero, where you get zero population growth, or ZPG. Right, and ZPG basically happens when you get a total fertility rate, right? Remember that stat from before, of 2.1. All right, 2.1, and we have a replacement rate. So if you see, right, our idyllic little family here, mommy and a daddy have 2 kids, right? Mommy and a daddy get old and pass away. Those 2 kids have replaced them in the population. Right? The 0.1 is just in case there's childhood accidents or infertility issues or something along those lines. The US and parts of Europe are currently in this stage. Right? Most of Europe, you're going to see this in Australia as well. Low birth rates, low death rates, right? And population becomes very stable. Right? There's not a lot of population growth. So there it is. Notice that death rate goes up because in developed countries, you're seeing an older population. Right? Stage 4 countries are going to be old, and so death rates are going to be higher because there's more old people in the society. In the stage 2, right, you don't see a lot of old people, right? But you're going to see old people here, right? And so you actually see an increase, a slight increase in death rate, and it meets birth rate, and then the natural increase rate goes back to where stage 1 was, except it's a lot more stable than stage 1, which was kind of chaotic. All right, Denmark's a good example of that. Notice that the population has stabilized right in here. All right, and Denmark is actually very interesting because Denmark is pushing for more fertility. There's a whole public service campaign centered around getting the Danish to actually have more children, right? Because they fear they're going to go in something called stage 5, which is a negative population. But we see population being roughly about the same. Increase rate is near zero, and you see a very stabilized, flattened population rate. All right, which leads us to SPL, our last concept here. Stationary population levels, at the level at which a country's population ceases to grow, right? You will see a focus on aging when this occurs. This should happen in the next century if everything goes according to plan. But again, we look at places like the Congo, right? This population pyramid, which we'll learn about in our next section, you're going to see a lot of young people and not a lot of old people. Right, you're going to see growth happening, slow growth happening in the United States. By the way, the United States does grow through immigration, so keep that in mind, right? That immigration, the movement of people, is not something we're talking about yet. That's chapter 3, right? Negative growth you're going to see in places like Germany. We'll talk more about that as we move through chapter 2.